from the Wilderness. I'm John Kirkwood, and we are at the beginning of a new series about the trauma that is induced at a very young age in the evangelical world based on some of the doctrines that are taught that, quite frankly, are psychologically harmful. And big picture, they don't border on child abuse. They are child abuse. Now, I have to give you a caveat here because this could anger a lot of people. However, if you're watching this show, you probably are familiar with the show, and so the odds are you've probably lived through this and you know the dangers of it. I want to speak to you about this as somebody who's been on all three sides of the coin. Yeah, I know. I was raised in an evangelical environment that taught original sin. I raised my children in that environment. So I've been a child who's lived through it. I've been an adult who has chosen to raise their children through it. And I'm going to stop there for a moment and suggest to you that I know my parents meant well. I know my parents loved me. I know my parents thought that they were conferring truth to me, and they meant it for my well-being. I also know that as a parent, that was the same intention for me. I accepted it as truth, as divine truth, that I wanted to pass on to my children so that they could avoid the pitfalls of even, hell, and to understand reality and so forth. And it wasn't until years later till I began unpacking the faith that was given to me that I freely accepted for years that I realized how harmful this is. And oftentimes now when I'm talking to people who are kind of on the fence, they've lived through the same background I have. They're in the evangelical world. They've accepted original sin as it was passed along to them in Sunday school or CCD or from their parents and grandparents, what have you. I will ask them the question, what to you is sin? How do you explain to somebody who hasn't grown up in your environment the logic or the doctrine of sin, and how does that differ from how an anthropologist would view what it means to be human? Because I really think this is the question at the crux of the issue. I know that the argument from pulpits was always one of superiority. We looked down on the world because we were told to hate the world. We were told that the world is not only a dangerous place, but that it is at enmity against God. And we were told in that world, one of the false premises that they rely on is that all men are created good, that they are intrinsically good. And we scoffed at that and laughed at that because we knew that men and mankind were intrinsically bad. They were intrinsically evil. And we could point to a lot of evidence of that. Wars, bloodshed, man's inhumanity to man, slavery, all kinds of things, to point out how bad they were. And the other side could point out some things that were noble that humans had accomplished and so forth. And they didn't really have an answer for the badness of mankind, and Christians really didn't have an answer for the goodness of mankind. And I'm going to come back to that, even though we thought we did, because there was always that verse that hung around that without faith it is impossible to please God. And we were taught that you could build children's hospitals and still not please God if you were outside the faith. Which there's a lot of cognitive dissonance in the world that we grew up in. But I want to focus this study on what it means to children. We're going to talk about what happens when your earliest identity is wrapped up in shame and what it takes to untangle from that. So what happens when, before you even learn to read, you're taught that you deserve hell? So let's get into this. Let's get into this by, I didn't, folks, I'm sorry. I was a little bit late coming into this. I've got to add some notes that I wanted to share with you. So there's the first one. So I will bring in the first one, and as I bring in the others, we could talk about this. All right, so what is original sin? What's commonly thought of as original sin today is actually an idea that dates back to, now I say Augustine, some people say Augustine. I'm not going to argue over it. If you say Augustine, if you say potato and I say potato, I actually say potato. It's not worth arguing about, but Augustine's idea that all humans inherit guilt and moral corruption from Adam and Eve. And this story does seem ridiculous to people outside the faith. Even some people within the faith will point to biblical passages, particularly in the prophets, Ezekiel and elsewhere, that say it's not divine, that it's to hold somebody's sin against them, if it's their father's sin or grandfather's sin or something like that. And there's other passages that say God holds sin against mankind to the fourth generation, like does punish the children of sinners, which does seem unjust, doesn't it? So there's this argument here, but the argument from Augustine is that because we were born of Adam and Eve, Adam is our federal head, that Adam's sin, eating of a forbidden fruit, as told by a talking snake, makes us damaged goods. And we are born at enmity against God. We are born as enemies of God. We are born hell-bound and hell-deserving, and God is completely within his justice, the realm of his justice, to cancel us and to throw us into hellfire. So Augustine's idea is that all humans inherit guilt and moral corruption. So not just the sin nature, not just the capacity to sin, but sin itself, from Adam and Eve, right? What do sinners do? They sin. And this has been not only accepted. That didn't come across right. Here's a depiction of, children being dropped into hell flames. How does that work? Some people will argue an age of innocence and so forth. And that's an argument within Christianity. But there is this idea, especially in Calvinism, that because our federal head rebelled against God, that we are born rebels and we are hell-bound, we are hell-deserving. I was taught in my upbringing that we were garbage headed for the dump, and that our only value comes in our redemption if Jesus intervenes, if the Holy Spirit and Jesus intervene. So this we were taught from a young age, and yet the cognitive dissonance is that much of Christianity says don't fear. And it's all built on fear. It's built on fear of God rejecting us, of us being sinners, of us deserving hell, of hell being inevitable unless there's an intercession and a reconciliation. Even in some corners of Christianity, I say some because not all believe in rapture theology, but in my particular corner of evangelicalism, we were even taught about the rapture, and teenagers were shown movies about the rapture and how you could be left behind if you weren't right with God. And this created in children this uneasy state, as it would when you tell a child that a parent might abandon them or punish them for a lifetime, or simply not choose to take them with them. I mean, one of the scariest things in my life was being left behind by a parent at a church on a couple of occasions. One parent thought the other parent had me in the car, and I was left behind with a bunch of strangers. And that was far from hell, but, and far from the rapture, but it certainly felt like it. I know I grew up with friends that said they'd arrive home from school and their parents didn't let them know that they weren't going to be around that day or something, and they'd arrive home to an empty house and think they'd missed the rapture and have a panic attack. I've had that experience myself. So you can imagine the trauma that sets in for children that are, excuse me, just getting over a cold, that are born into an environment like this. And this is always reinforced by verses, and these verses are taught in Sunday school in Awana. Verses like in Psalm 51, where David is remorseful over the Bathsheba experiment, and he's quoted as saying, surely I was born in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. And that verse is brought over not just to applied to David after he had committed rape and adultery and a betrayal of one of his soldiers, all kinds of things, but that was meant to apply to the whole human race. So now, not only is Adam's sin imparted to us, but David's sin is. So now all of a sudden, all of evangelical children are taught that David's sin is passed on to us, that we're really all that way in God's judgment, in God's eyes. Because why? Because we're imperfect. I would say now because we're human. So remember the argument I started with, how in evangelicalism there's only black and white. There's only good guys and bad guys. There's the black hat and the white hat. And if we wear the white hat, what does everyone else wear? And so they portray the argument as you either can believe in that mankind is intrinsically evil or mankind is intrinsically good. There was no nuance in that argument. There was no third option. Whereas most people can realize just by their experience and their study of history, of human history, that there's a continuum we live on in humanity. Forgive me. And that continuum suggests that human beings can live and make choices that take them into very deep darkness. In other words, we could commit gross acts of evil, and we also have the capacity to exhibit amazing, striking, rapturous moments of ecstasy in good, in sacrifice for others, in noble accomplishments. The truth is, both of these things are true, and not only are they both true, but as far as the black hat and the white hat, we all have those hats in our closet. And sometimes a man who wears a black hat for his whole life can don the white hat in an extreme moment of stress, as in A Tale of Two Cities, something like that. We've all known it to happen. Or the reverse is true. Somebody could live a mostly righteous life as viewed by the world, and then all of a sudden lose it and commit a great act of ignorance or cruelty or wickedness. And the truth is, we live on that continuum, folks. And while you might make an argument that certain people lean one way or the other, or that even certain tribes and civilizations lean one way or the other, different time periods and so forth, the truth is that no one is perfect. And to make the imperfect an element of original sin and say, see, is a circular argument. To make the argument that our imperfection is sin and our Creator created us that way, and yet expects more of us. Yeah, there's a great deal of cognitive dissonance in there, along with the spiritual trauma that's communicated to children when we're told we're a sinner and our heart is deceitful above all things, and we are desperately wicked, and that apart from Jesus we are nothing. And we all know that no good parent would say that to a child. No good parent would drum into a child's head, not even 1 hour a week, or 1 hour a week on Sunday morning, 1 hour a week on Wednesday night, and in youth group, and at family devotions and at evening prayers. No good parent would tell their children how awful they are. No good parent would try to impute that on them as an identity. No good husband would say to his wife, "You're nothing without me." We all know, we've seen the movies of bad husbands and bad parents who've done the opposite, and we know intrinsically in our heart that that's what's evil, that is what is objectionable, that is what is ignorant and cruel and wicked. And yet we ascribe these things to a perfect, benevolent creator? No, it doesn't make sense. And many Christians have outgrown it, but they've had to break the chains of the Bible and their upbringing, or at least what they were told about the Bible and their upbringing. So let's talk about the psychological impact about this for children and how children's brains work. Oh, I got to bring in my second point for y'all. Let me do that. It's only going to take a second, folks. Bear with me. All right, point 2. Okay. And here's how it gets internalized by kids who are told you're a sinner. Well, then we're asked what sin is, right? And sin, of course, to the Christian is that which is contrary to the will of God, right? That's what we're told. That which is contrary to the will of God is what it means. Oh, what did I just do? I'm sorry, folks. That point 2 disappeared. Let me bring it back in here. When our children are told you're a sinner, when they're told that, well, now we're not working at all. I'll just have to stay in the points with you folks, if you don't mind. How does this get internalized by kids that are told you're a sinner? Not even based on their behavior. This argument isn't even based on behavior. They're told that they're born that way. You're born losing. You're born and you can't win unless you tap out. Your heart is deceitful, meaning it tends towards wickedness. Nothing you can do about it. And that apart from Jesus, you're nothing. And then we tell our children not to be fearful, that Christianity isn't fear-based. When it's all fear-based, all of that is fear-based to a child. All of it. And what does it do? Well, folks, children's brains aren't equipped to hold metaphysical guilt. They absorb it as identity because that's what we're telling them. That is your identity. And unless you do something drastic, that's going to be your fate. That's the direction you're on. You're already on the train headed to hell, right? So what does it produce in children? Well, chronic guilt, body shame, low self-worth. It creates people-pleasing in children and this idea that that they need to be spiritually perfect, which creates its own set of, neuroses, because we can't live up to that perfection. Although there's certain children who have certain demeanors certain personalities that try to live up to that perfectionism. And it destroys them. It breaks them. And we're told we're broken. We're told we're damaged goods. It's so odd. I remember my Calvinist friends who worked with me in the pro-life movement, and just as a witness, I would hear these well-meaning people arguing for the nobility of the fetus and how wonderful the fetus is. And they would quote verses like, you were fearfully and wonderfully made. See, there are verses in the Bible that that don't paint in Rembrandt black. And so when they're arguing for the validity of the fetus, they would go to those passages. And then they'd walk into their pulpits on Sunday to talk about total depravity. And they'd forget about all those, how we're fearfully and wonderfully made, how we're created in the image of God. They'd set that aside and they'd quote all those other verses, like we were created in sin and iniquity, and our hearts are deceitful, and we're incapable of anything good. And so I put that together once to a Calvinist pastor friend of mine. I said, so let me get this total story right. So when we're outside the abortion clinic, we are made in the image of God, and we're fearfully and wonderfully made. But at the same time, we are made in the image of God, fearfully and wonderfully made, totally depraved wretches, hell-bound, hell-deserving, garbage for the dump. Is that right? And the answer was yes. Yes, that's right. That was the nuance that they wanted to accept. And that doesn't come across without cognitive dissonance to a child. Is God that lousy of a planner, of a creator? Did God miss that loophole in his perfect planning? It does become a huge stumbling block. But imagine telling children this. It is child abuse. Now, I know a lot of you are in a position that I am. A lot of you have lived your whole life in this commitment. And maybe you're just coming to grips with the fact that maybe not everything we learned was gospel truth. Not everything we learned really is divine. Some of it is the doctrine of demons, and as a parent, now you have this extra burden of guilt that you passed along this poison to your own children. That even though you've deconstructed from it, even though you've maybe apologized to them, even though you've taken a different direction, you still carry this guilt that, yeah, damage was done because you raised them in an environment that was negative and that would put them behind an 8-ball, so to speak, psychologically and so forth. And that's a whole other episode of how we deal with that guilt and shame. But the first thing to do with shame is to speak it so it loses its power. That's part of why I'm doing this series. So you could drop that burden, so you could break those chains that you've worn for so long that you think they're jewelry now. No, we need to break those chains. So anyway, this is what it does in the minds of young children. When a child is told that they are broken before they even do wrong, they stop believing they can ever be whole. So I know there's a lot of scripture out there that's popping into your head because you memorized it. This is part of the wickedness of growing up in that environment. It's pounded into our heads from the youngest age. And yet there are other verses. God saw all that he had made and that it was very good. Now we're told, but that was before the fall. See, you don't understand the fall. And the fall is Augustinian original sin. And yet Jesus says, unless you become like little children. What did he mean by that? What did he mean by pointing to little children? If they're little devils. No, he wasn't pointing to them because they are intrinsically wicked, but because they are open. They're curious. They're hungry to learn. Yeah, he was pointing to their innocence. You were fearfully and wonderfully made, in other words. But what about all our righteousness is as filthy rags? Remember that verse? That one pops into your mind. There are none righteous, no, not one. Well, I know you can quote scripture to shame children, but you can also quote scripture to heal children, because the Bible is what we make it. I try not to quote a lot from the Bible on the show because to many listeners it's a trigger. Many listeners can't get beyond what was pounded into their head when they were in the pew. And they've escaped that now. And they've kind of thrown the Bible to the side. That's okay. That's okay. I'm only quoting it to show you that there is an argument to be had there. Right? So I don't know. I'm sure that this episode might have stirred up some memories you've had from when you were a child, when you first learned this, when you first were told how wrong you were from birth. And you didn't see that in your experience if you were an older child and you had a little brother or sister being born into the world. You did see them as innocent, as you saw your grandmother was pretty innocent. And this whole idea of original sin didn't seem to fit. Didn't seem accurate. This whole idea of total depravity didn't seem accurate, because if the world was totally depraved, it would be like Mad Max. You really wouldn't want to leave the house, right? You really couldn't leave the house. And yet there's enough in the world that we know that there is the capacity for evil, and we see it in our headlines and on our news shows, and unfortunately sometimes outside our front door. And the honest approach to that is that humanity lives on a continuum of imperfection. And yet, even in our most imperfect state, humans can, even humans outside of the Christian faith, can live and act nobly and Christ-like. And oftentimes, it's those who we do see living apart from Christ who are the most Christ-like. I mean, you live in America today, those bearing Christ's name are very far from Christ. They're cruel. That's an episode for another day, but you know how I feel about those who sold their soul for a bowl of Trumpism. And you can't balance the two. You can't say you're living a Christ-like life and embrace the cruelty and the wickedness and the ego and the brash immorality of what's coming from that corner. So I just want to end with this. How do we reclaim our worth? How do we allow healing to take place? Especially if you're like me, somebody who's lived it as a child and as an adult. Somebody who carries the guilt and shame that was instilled on them in their childhood, and also the guilt and shame that I have as a parent for perpetrating this. Well, first of all, you should be proud that you're at a place now where you realize it's harm and you're not still perpetrating it, and you intentionally want to be better. So maybe you have asked your children for forgiveness. And if you haven't, that should be on your list, right? Just like a 12-step list, looking for amends. You should make amends to those you've harmed by carrying wrong beliefs, even though you were well-meaning at the time. That's what we do. That's the better part of humanity. That's how shame dies, when we name it and we ask for forgiveness for it. So that's how we break our chains. So there's some, in psychology would call it inner child work, right? Unpacking that thing. Some of us have to reparent ourselves with compassion. And that might include forgiving our parents. When you recognize that your parents were doing the best they could, that they meant well just as you did, it's easier to forgive them for it, even though you've had to carry the baggage of wrong belief for your whole life, even though you still might have low self-worth that you struggle with, or people-pleasing, or perfectionism that has caused many a scar, many a stumble through life. It might have cost you a divorce, might have cost you your family, might have cost you precious relationships that could have developed into something beautiful that were sacrificed because of the ignorance you lived in at the time. Who knows the total cost of wrong thinking? And yet we can't just live in remorse. We have to grow beyond that. We have to heal beyond belief. We have to free ourselves of that, or we're still giving it power. We have to cut off the power, the supply line to that wrong thinking. So what do? Well, we reparent ourselves with compassion and empathy, and we create new frameworks. Some of them may be spiritual. Some of you are at a place where you don't want anything to do with that kind of language. Great. But you know what I'm talking about. You set new frameworks for healthy living, mental health, physical health, social health. That's going to include setting boundaries and maybe extending forgiveness and maybe not extending forgiveness. I agree with Dr. Ramani, who's the world's leading expert on narcissism. Forgiveness isn't always the answer. That's one thing we learned in Christianity that was also wrong. Not everyone should get our forgiveness. Anyway, that's also an episode for another day. So resetting spiritual frameworks that affirm dignity over depravity. Because that's something that we should grow to understand, is that there is a dignity that humanity deserves. Every human deserves an element of dignity, even those who've made grave mistakes. Doesn't mean that punishment isn't involved if they've broken the law and committed acts of evil. It doesn't mean that there aren't repercussions. But those repercussions shouldn't be primal. They should be guided by dignity and worth and value. And many people who commit crimes and awful things have grown up in a world where they weren't allowed dignity. Do you know how many criminals are the result of foster care? Because they were never loved as children. They never had value. They were never given. They were passed along, some in 27 different households. And they never felt like they belonged. Their identity was shattered from youth. So I'm just saying we need to have empathy for every human being. And part of that is resetting a spiritual framework, or a framework that affirms dignity over depravity. Yes, there is human depravity, sure, but it's a far cry from what we've been taught in the Augustinian system. The voice in your head, let's just end with this, because I think this is maybe the most powerful thing you can hear today, and if this is all you take from today, so let it be. The voice that you hear in your head that calls you garbage, that's not God. It might be people speaking for God, saying they've heard from God, but it's not God. So, thank you to those of you who responded last week to this first session, this first episode of Healing Beyond Belief. Next week, we take up the doctrine of hell. Well, we're swinging for the fences here. So, original sin this week. Next week, the doctrine of hell. These are all fear-based doctrines that create trauma in not just children, but adults. Into our adult lives, people carry this trauma. So next week, that's where we will land. And until then, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week.